Hey there folks, it's me TheTacticalBrit and I'm back again today looking at Outpost mode in Battlefield 5, and to cut a long story short, we're going to be looking at whether or not this mode is really worth playing, issues it has, and everything in between. Now before I get into that, I recently made a video talking about the future of the Battlefield franchise, and I had a lot of comments saying, well, you know, the game actually isn't in a pretty good state, you know, there's so many bugs, so many lags, so many issues and everything in between. And I totally agree with that, and I do want to just say that I felt like I was talking about that video in the context of knowing that those bugs are going to be fixed. Now, ironically, I actually installed Battlefield 5 onto a slightly updated PC today. I added some new SSDs and also upgraded my 2070 to a 2080 Ti, and almost hilariously and in a current sense of irony, fired up the game and just got absolutely obliterated. Like, micro stuttering everywhere, huge problems, stuff I haven't even seen on PS4 Pro, which is almost embarrassing considering I was running at low latency mode and averaging around 170 to 180 FPS. Now, I think this is a serious issue in Battlefield 5 and needs all kinds of resolving before it's even worth talking about stuff like different game modes. At the moment, I'd argue, had I not done some major gymnastics with settings in order to make the game remotely usable, that Battlefield 5 is almost unplayable. And to anybody who is picking up the game now, just after EA Play and all the announcements, to fire it up and see some of the stuff they're seeing, it would almost be an instantaneous refund, and I'm really concerned about that in general as far as Battlefield 5 goes. But on to Outpost mode, which seems to be an almost rejig of Conquest, but also a little bit different. I must say that this actually is very reminiscent of some of the team play you see in games like Battlefield 2 and things like Project Reality, and the lack of being able to spawn on actual objective points and having to spawn on squad mates, for example, really is the kind of feature that puts the game in a direction that's much more team play based, and I feel makes players just in general more conscious about how they're playing in Battlefield 5, be that whether or not they're playing aggressively so their squad mates can respawn on them, or just making sure that things like spawn beacons and revives are much more prevalent in the game mode. But on the whole, it's very much a different take on Conquest, much more of a focus on things like reinforcements, which I feel have been neglected in the game, and really does provide a level of team play in Battlefield that I don't think you see in any other mode. Lots of people looking out for each other, lots of people working together, and definitely lots of people pushing to objectives at very similar levels. And this creates a very chaotic environment, but also one that I found to be pretty enjoyable, and I felt out of the two maps available, Arras was actually a much stronger map for Outpost than something like Mercury, and the reasoning for that was because a lot of the objectives on Mercury were actually within direct line of sight of one another, and things as simple as, like, you know, just spamming cannons and anything in between just became far too vicious to really make the mode enjoyable, in my opinion, and those direct lines of sight gave things like tanks, planes, and everything in between just ridiculous freedom to completely destroy folks. So ultimately we have a large game mode variant. It's a lot different from some of the previous modes we've had in the sense that for once there's been a grander scale focus here, be it the fact that there'll be combined arms in this, and also the fact that this is, as a Conquest variant, much larger. It is very chaotic still, but it's definitely not the ridiculousness we saw in things like Grind and Fortress, and I actually think this is actually a pretty impressive mode. There's something about it and about the breakup of gameplay that makes it quite enjoyable in the sense that although you can't spawn on actual objectives, you actually have to work with your squad mates pretty closely. Now that could be a bit of a gift and a curse, but I found in this situation squad mates were actually much more inclined to play together because they felt the need to play together in order to do particularly well. And the kind of pushes you see from objective to objective across various different teammates, be it blueberries or squad mates, is also pretty damn good too. I feel as though this is kind of the team play a lot of people wanted from Battlefield and Battlefield 5, but ultimately just didn't really get it, whereas this variant of Conquest does so much more things to try and push that kind of team play agenda, and it's something I think is very positive and something I think is very enjoyable from Battlefield as a whole. Now moving on to some of the more negatives around this mode, and I'll be honest with you, there are quite a few. Now, as with any given kind of mode that is, you know, in and out, it's a rotation kind of mode that will be in Battlefield, fixating on the negatives too much is kind of a downer in the sense that there's just not really a lot of point because the game mode will be removed at some point. And in fact, it does make sense in some cases because a better iteration of the game mode could in fact be rotated back in the future. Now, in my opinion, Mercury on this map just doesn't work. This game mode and Mercury just seem very incompatible. It seems ironic considering Mercury almost seems like it was built for this game mode in the sense that you have various different radio stations and outposts and stuff like that in between. But the big issue I found here was that the vast majority of these have direct sightlines to one another, and because they have direct sightlines to one another, it just ends up in this pure dribble chaos where people use cannons, tanks, Pac-38s and everything in between to just do sheer damage to one another without any real need for skill being involved here. I found that in Arras the opposite was true. There are certainly some areas where things get a bit back and forth, but for the most part you could disengage from an objective and area, go to a new one and begin a brand new engagement, which effectively meant that everything was reset and it was just you versus them. You know, there wasn't this sort of ongoing I'm going to spam you from across the map that very much in my opinion defeated the enjoyment of the game mode. Now I think Arras is better in the sense because what I've noticed in sort of this situation is that you find better engagements in terms of what's happening on the objectives in clusters of people. You know, people are clustering together and fighting on these objectives in a much more positive manner than the sort of zerging and spam cannoning that you're seeing in Mercury. Now, it's not to say that this doesn't exist at certain points on Arras, it's just definitely much less obvious and significant. And I found in so many different occasions that Mercury just ended up being this one large explosive fest that was all too unenjoyable. Now moving on to my next gripe, and probably my largest, planes. I honestly, it's so hard to try and get this right, and it is so hard to try and, you know, change things and make the balance there, but bombers on this game mode just completely ruin this game mode. Now, that's not to say that I think Battlefield shouldn't be combined arms and shouldn't give people variation and shouldn't allow people to choose how they want to play. But at the same token, what we're really witnessing here is just entire swarms and swarms of infantry being bombarded and destroyed because the game mode in itself is designed to force infantry into small spaces of land. And even if you did have 2 or 3 AA guns, the likelihood is, on any given objective, that a bomber will reach you and bomb you to oblivion before you can take it out of the sky. This issue is more confounded by the fact that because this meta exists, and because it's so easy and almost so satisfactory to try and get onto one of these bombers and take out all of these people, nobody feels inclined to get on an airplane and counter the bombers in the sky. And the typical arguments I've had against bombers being banned from certain game modes is, well, why don't you just get on an AA, or why don't you just get in a plane? And in this scenario, because it's such a wide open vast space, and because regardless if you had 4 AAs or 1, and because of the fact that everybody wants to be a bomber because it's so successful, you just have this ongoing ecosystem of clusterfuck in this game mode that is just not beneficial for anybody. And personally, I would ban bombers completely from this game mode. Hell, I'd probably even go as far as just taking aerial vehicles out. And I just think that's of the benefit of the game mode to be a better pace. I think it's better because it reduces some of the already obscene explosive spam that you're seeing in this game mode. And ultimately, as somebody who tends to be a pretty firm protector of allowing people to play however they want to play and choosing whatever they want to play, I just really found that in this scenario, bombers just weren't the way forward. They just completely defeated some of the overall positive gameplay and player movements between objectives that otherwise without them would have gone off without a hitch. But in the current scenario, it just ends up being, so I'm trying to build this radio tower, kaboom, oh, great. And that just level of pure sliminess, as you can see from some of the pilots, is just not something I found very enjoyable. And also, truth be told, beyond the indirect fire on objectives, bombers and planes in general don't offer anything to this game mode beyond just pissing lots and lots of people off. And finally, I'd say that this game mode still ultimately suffers from the underpinning issue that tanks are still very weak in the game, and because of that, most tankers will resort to sitting up on hills and sitting in alleyways in order to just blow people to pieces, as opposed to pushing onto objectives like we'd want from them in Battlefield. Back in the days of Battlefield 4, where it was almost kind of easy to be a tank and very aggressive to be a tank, it was quite easy for you to pop an active protection system and really push an objective in a very aggressive way, but that no longer exists in this scenario, and I feel as though a rebalance of tanks and how they're designed is certainly needed in order to make game modes like this of combined arms much more effective, so vehicles aren't just sitting on hilltops in order to be effective as it presently stands. It's something I'd like to see, and hopefully it's something that does change in the not too distant future. So on the whole, I'd say this is an okay mode. I'd say it's around about a 6 or 7 out of 10. It has some really enjoyable parts and some really frustrating parts, and I feel as though that tends to be the trend with rotational game modes. I'd like to see it return at some point in a better format, and hopefully with a bit of luck we'll see some performance fixes and improvements in general to the game that will make things like these rotational game modes just on the whole much better to swallow. As always folks, it's been me, the Tactical Brit. Hit that subscribe and notification bell, and I'll catch you again soon in another video.